I'm Joanna here from Joanna Reads. And today I'm here with my good friends Philip Chase and Lecton from Reading from the Depths. And we are going to be discussing The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. I'll just go ahead and speak for myself really quickly. This is my third or fourth Le Guin novel. I think actually my third. I read The Dispossessed was the first Le Guin book I read. And I've also read The Word for World is Forest. And then this is the third one. And all three of those are in the heinous cycle. But I've additionally read her book on writing, her nonfiction book, Steering the Craft, and her essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, which Philip Chase has often talked about on his channel. He's the influence on me reading that essay, which is excellent on fantasy prose. And I'm so excited to talk about this book. So we'll just go ahead and get first impressions, I suppose. So we'll start out. Philip, this was your first sci-fi book from Le Guin. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm a
So
huge
we're
fan.
kind of in reverse roles here because I still haven't read
Yep.
any of Le Guin's fantasy, but you're
Mm,
very familiar with her fantasy and haven't yet read any of her sci-fi.
yeah. Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan of her Earthsea books, but I had not read any of her science fiction yet. So this was my first Le Guin science fiction book, and I expected to love it simply because I do love her essays, and I think she's brilliant, or she was brilliant. And sure enough, I thought that she very effectively explored some really important and still relevant things in The Left Hand of Darkness, including, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, including gender and sexuality, and but also some big political things too. Very timely, I feel, the nature of patriotism. What is patriotism, and what is it necessary to hate someone else, the other, in order to love one's own? That's a question that she explores in here, I think, very effectively through the main relationship that we see develop in the course of this story. I think it was just a beautiful relationship. They say that the characters are not as important in science fiction, but I found this to be a very compelling and very moving relationship that developed between these characters in here. And so, yeah, so there's a lot in here about the way we perceive ourselves, the way our societies are set up, how much of what we are is biological, how much of it is social. There's some big questions in here in a relatively short space. It's not a very big book. It's a pretty quick read, but it's full of thoughtfulness and a very compelling journey that I find myself, I'm sure I'm going to be thinking about it for a long time. Yeah, those are my general thoughts.
Oh, beautifully said. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. I was nervous because I
Oh,
know,
really?
yes, because I know science fiction is not always resonated with you as much as fantasy.
Oh, I love fantasy more than anything, but there are some science fiction books I've read that I've really found very engaging too. So yeah.
Yes, wonderful. And I agreed with everything you said too. So I'm so excited to discuss it further. Lectin, I am so excited to hear your thoughts now. And I watched your wonderful video where you were talking about Le Guin's, no, you were talking about, yeah, you were talking about
Yeah,
the forward to the book of this
exactly.
book.
Yeah.
Mhm. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything Philip said. I think it's right, directly on with what he was doing. For me, what I found really compelling is right on the first page, right? She starts and she says, "Truth is a matter of the imagination," which is how the narration starts, right? And I think that it's such a compelling way to bring you into this world that she's created, and the idea that sometimes the mere facts aren't enough to give the reality, that you need to do something more than the mere facts alone to understand how something really is. And so that's how she starts the story and brings you in. And I think for all of us, that the three of us rather, we're used to reading sci-fi and fantasy and these kind of speculative genres. And this story, you step into it and you don't feel like you're stepping into a totally different world, even though there's intergalactic travel and there is this random planet that is always winter, that has a strange biology. All those things go to the wayside to tell a very human story about what it means to understand yourself and what it means to understand the other and how those things work. And so the idea of this being sci-fi or speculative fiction almost falls away because her writing is so compelling. I mean, she's telling such a strong story that she just drew me in right away. So I'm excited to talk about all the things that Philip mentioned and also just the meta idea of how story is used to to understand truth that sometimes can't be laid bare with Giacomo, and how that is like kind of an ethos behind this book that was compelling to me as a reader.
Oh, so well said. Yeah. Since you brought up the beginning of the book, I want to go ahead and bring that up as well because this is a very famous book. It's a very famous book, not only of science fiction, but of literature in general. And it also has a very famous opening, which you already quoted. I think one of the things I noted about that beginning, of course, there's a little bit of an epigraph there talking about how this is from the archives of Hain. It's a transcript. Then it goes into, I'll make my report as if I told a story, for I was taught as a child on my home world that truth is a matter of the imagination. The soundest fact may fail or prevail in the style of its telling, like that singular organic jewel of our seas, which grows brighter as one woman wears it, and worn by another, dulls and goes to dust. Facts are no more solid, coherent, round, and real than pearls are, but both are sensitive. And he also goes on to say that the story is not all mine, nor told by me alone. There are a few different things that come up for me when I read the beginning of that. One, especially the first part of that sentence, I'll make my report as if I am told a story. It sounds almost like it has a journalistic tone to it. And he's conveying this, but then also when he goes further, he says in the second paragraph, indeed, I am not sure whose story it is. You could judge better. It seems like he's taking on a somewhat journalistic tone and he's trying to make it bring some objective space to the narrative, allowing the reader to have their own interpretations. And yet there is a lyrical quality to that first paragraph as you go on as well. It's not written in the most terse style. I feel like that sets the tone because you understand that this character is starting to see that there's more to truth than maybe what he believed. That's the sense I get, that he's starting to see beyond his biases even as he's writing this story. And any other thoughts
Yeah.
about that? Yeah.
I mean, I agree that the way the story is constructed is really smart as well. So as you mentioned in the beginning, it gives it like epigraph that says it's part of a transcript. And in the beginning, we go back and forth from this main transcript. Then we also have some like folklore, like little folk stories mixed in, and it goes back and forth between the mode of storytelling. And then it gets to the back half where it then intersperses journal from the other kind of main character in the survival part of the back half. And so you get to compare and contrast these journals from Estevez, the other character that he's surviving with, and Genli's transcript. And the style is so different between them. But this going back and forth between Genli's narration that he is creating for, for the Ecumen, for the government that he is an envoy of, compared that to the style of the journals of Estevez, or to the folklore that's mixed in the beginning and these like tales of the foretellers and these kind of things. And I just think that as a storytelling device, she's pulling you in to show the how style itself can be manipulated to convey different emotional experiences and emotional, especially at the end. I mean, we're doing spoilers in this discussion? Yeah or no?
Yes, we are going into spoilers. Yes.
So, well, first off, I think the story itself was interesting. That the first 2/3 of it are almost like a political espionage thriller, and then the back half is like a survival thriller, right? So even though it's all under this umbrella of sci-fi, it has these very distinct tones, right? In the beginning is all this political, not espionage, but political thriller, right? Where he's dealing with governments and dealing with, these two warring parties and playing them against each other and so forth. And then you get it onto the ice and you're just trying to survive. So it has these two different subgenres within. And Genli, our main character, has such a fascination and a need to assign gender, right? So he's looking at these characters who are hypothetically, he calls them hermaphroditic, neuters, 5-6 of the time as well, right? Yeah, he still assigns certain characteristics as this is more masculine, this is more feminine.
Mm.
And yet, at the end, when he's traveling with Estevez, he codes Estevez as more feminine. But Estevez's journal is very, very laid back, stripped bare, just pure facts only almost. Like this is the time of day, this is what we did, how we traveled. And his is much more poetic and much more flowing and much more what we would code as feminine. So Genli is writing this more feminine style, whereas Estervan is writing in a more masculine style, even though he's quoting Estervan as being more feminine, at least at that back half of the story, which I think is just Le Guin playing with these whole ideas, right? I mean, gender is so important in the story. You think this story was written in 1969, and the idea of gender as a social construct existed maybe in the late 50s, but it really didn't come into vogue in the 70s. And you didn't have Judith Butler's idea of gender as a performance until her book Gender Trouble, which was in 1990. So really, in 1969, this was at the cutting edge of like feminist ideas of how gender exists and how gender is socially constructed as opposed to biologically inherent. And I think Le Guin is playing with that throughout this whole story, which, as a storytelling device, brings you deeper into the story as well, because everything can't be trusted 100%, right? There's a little bit of unreliability.
Yes, I agree. I feel like she is kind of inserting that room for unreliability. And I love what you said about how if you look at Genli's, I think it's Genli. Is it Genli or Genli?
Yeah.
Genli. When we look at Genli's passages, they could be interpreted, or if you look at the style, it could be a little bit more considered a little bit more lyrical, which we might associate with more feminine. Whereas you're right, Estevan, like I didn't even think about that. But when we read Estevan's journal entries, they do read very
Mm-hmm.
journalistic. I hadn't even
Yeah.
considered that. That's really well spoken. Philip, I would love to hear your thoughts on Le Guin's prose in this book. Any
Oh,
thoughts that you
sure.
have? Yeah.
Well, I think that Lecton makes a great point there about the different styles. And another thing that Le Guin, I think, brilliantly reinforces by offering Genli's perspective. He's from the ecumen. There's a certain kind of governance that he is representing, that he's selling, in fact, here on this
Mm-hmm.
planet, on Winter. And you also get Estraven's perspective because he does some of the right. We also get some cool, like old folkloric, creation account and all kinds of really little inserts that help us understand the characters even more deeply, I think. So a little bit of world building inserted here and there by Le Guin very effectively, I thought. But it's interesting that you have these opposing, sometimes opposing perspectives that gradually come to understand each other throughout the narrative, because you do have different systems of governance that they're all, we're looking at, in a sense, this is a thought experiment of Le Guin's, not only to do with gender, but to do with governance. And she talks about, for example, there's the ecumen, which is I don't know even how to describe it, but it's a cooperative venture, sort of an interplanetary, communal style of governance, which seems to be pretty benevolent as far as we can have seen, at least. Of course, we've only got Genli's perspective on that. And then with even on Winter, you have these different stages of political evolution. You have Karhide, which is the more conservative of the two. Are they nations yet? I'm not sure. Karhide is sort of a monarchy, but there are areas of it that are very rural that pretty much rule themselves. But it's the old style anyway. And then
Yes.
you have Orgoreign. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but Orgoreign. This is a nation. This has evolved into a nation with a bureaucracy in place, and a often very callous bureaucracy at that. Like the people's humanity, it's not presented as good and evil either. By the way, though
No.
there are bad aspects of both of these cultures, and there are positives to both. I like that Le Guin. It's more of an exploration, really. But I also feel that Le Guin is coming from a place where I think she has a bit of an anarchist strain in her, and I believe that she also feels that there is something. Actually has something to do with the gender aspect of this as well. These are very much tied together. The political and the gender aspects of this. So for her, I believe she saw um, um, her Orgo reign particularly as evolving toward a more masculine style of governance. That this top-heavy, bureaucratic, very uh, um, I guess you could call it the people in charge, we know better, right? And you have to do it. And we'll re-educate you on one of these horrible labor farms or whatever they call them in there.
Yes, those work camps.
Yeah, the work camps. So there's a very top-down approach there, whereas I feel like Le Guin herself, if you were to ask her what she probably favored, is a more what she identified as a more feminine style of our kind of anarchist way of living, where people are allowed to be their own thing and not interfered with so much. So yeah, I love how we get these different perspectives on the political systems. And of course, you have Genli who's learning about all these things. Go
The
ahead.
way she introduces is also really smart, I think, because you
Yeah.
start in context which has the king, right? And you are given the impression that this is an authoritarian system. And so as he escapes, you think, oh, okay, now he's escaping to somewhere more civilized, to somewhere
Right.
more democratic, to somewhere that is going to be more efficacious. And at first, it seems that way until you realize how top heavy the bureaucracy is and how all they do is lying, conniving, and it's still going, like you said, it's going in this other direction. So she sets you up to say, okay, this kingdom that is run by a king is not effective. Look at here's democracy or some version of democracy. This is effective.
Yeah.
And then you see, oh no, that's not effective either. So she really is subtle in the way she builds it up and pulls the rug out from under you. So I think that's also just a simple way of doing it. As you said, there's nothing. She's not saying. I agree with you. I mean, Le Guin was an anarchist, right? So I don't think she's saying either of these are effective forms of government.
Yeah.
They're just different types of control, and they both have some positive. And there are some places in them where people can prosper and people can find joy and happiness. So there are other ways that people are still under different types of control, whether it be fear, whether it be something else. I think fear plays a really interesting part in both of these, especially in the autocratic. In that first dinner we had with Estevan, Estevan asked him if he knows Genli, if he knows anything about patriotism, and he says, "If patriotism isn't love for your homeland, then no, I don't." And he says, "It's not love for your homeland, fear of the other. That's what patriotism."
Yeah.
Which I think is just really a scary concept. That's what patriotism is. As you said, very on point right now. And then when he actually has this discussion with the king, I think you know, they point out how the king, even if what Genli represents is correct, that he is this person from the stars offering this, intergalactic, communal environment or system. All the king hears is, "You're taking away my power, and I don't matter, and I am a piece of dust in an interplanetary system that is so much bigger than me." And so the king is terrified, right? Because he's focused on power. And so when he has this conversation with the king, again, going to fear, king says to him, um, "I do fear you, envoy. I fear those who sent you. I fear liars and I fear tricksters, and worse, I fear the bitter truth. And so I rule my country well because only fear rules me. Nothing else works. Nothing else lasts long enough. You are what you say you are, yet you're a joke, a hoax. There's nothing in between the stars but void and terror and darkness. And you come out of that all alone, trying to frighten me. But I am already afraid, and I am the king. Fear is king." And I just think that is such a strong testament to what it means to live in that place and how that can totally govern your experience is really, really, it gets me thinking quite a lot, what the role of fear and the role, as you said, of patriotism and how those, and xenophobia and how they create something different.
Mm.
Absolutely.
But as you said, there are no labor camps in Karhide. So maybe it's, those labor camps are pretty terrifying. So you don't see that under the king's rule. You only see that under the Democrat. So it's really compelling.
Yeah, we also get the impression because of the disputes that they're having, these two lands, Karhide and I cannot remember how to say that word.
Orgo rain.
Orgorain. Yes. I'm going to probably mispronounce that. I apologize. You get the impression too that and I think this is where Estevan plays a role, is that there seems to be growing tensions, possibly escalating to their first war, that they haven't had any war.
The main character kind of posits that part of the reason they've never had war. They don't know war. They know there's murder and there's fighting and there's sometimes border skirmishes, but there's never been war. And he, to some extent, posits that has to do with the fact that they don't have gender the way that everywhere else does. So that by not having gender, everyone is on a type of equal footing. If any of the people from his planet come, any other ministers come, that he says a man wants his virility regarded, and a woman wants her femininity appreciated. however indirect and subtle the indications of regard and appreciation. On Winter, they will not exist. One is respected and judged only as a human being, and it is an appalling experience. So there's something about this lack of external gender markers that cause people not to progress in the same way, right? Because he posits that women, obviously, if women have to have a fear of becoming pregnant and therefore being pulled out of the labor force, then they're always held back by them. And that naturally means men always have an advantage. But here, either one of those can happen. You don't have that push and pull. And so he posits that as part of the reason there's never been a war. I don't know. War is coming anyway, it seems. So I don't know. How do you feel about that? That the idea that there's never been war is because of this um, uncommon gender situation or biological. Like, do you think that that is an actual reason why they didn't have war? Or maybe they just haven't evolved. The countries haven't, um, the nation states haven't existed in such a way that war was a political necessity. You know what I mean? And everything else on that planet is so hard and so hard, right? Living on Winter is a difficult life. That war would take so many resources that
Right.
I don't know if it has anything to do with gender. Maybe it just has to do with the environment. So I
That's a
was
really
wondering.
good point too. Yeah, that's a really
I think
solid
it's
point.
implied that it's also the climate that is a
Hmm.
factor here, that it would be very difficult to wage full-scale
Yeah.
war on a planet where you're just barely eking out a living, and it's cold so much of the time. I mean, even here on Earth, historically, people would take a break from warring at least for the winter, right? And then go at it again in the spring. But I also think that there's a gender factor here as well. And it's interesting that the book is called The Left Hand of Darkness. And we learned why. There's that wonderful quote in there: light is the left hand of darkness, and darkness is the right hand of light, or something like that. I think I got the gist of it. And on the cover of your edition, there's a yin yang
Yeah.
symbol there, which is not on the cover of mine. So I find that very interesting. But obviously, Le Guin was also very interested in Taoism and even did some translating, I think, of some Taoist literature. And you do see that in her Earthsea books a lot as well, the Taoist principles. But it's curious because you have these people who are androgynous on this planet. They are not, male female. They defy, in a sense, the idea of the yin yang, don't they? And it is perhaps that androgyny that has made them less likely to uh, the kind of patriotism that is starting to evolve on this planet hadn't existed historically because it was perhaps they less readily would otherize other people, not having the experience of being gendered the way the people with dual gender systems have. So there's a factor there as well. But I do find it very interesting that they're evolving toward a point which feels more familiar to Genly and more familiar to us, it seems, in several respects. And you have to wonder what is going to be the effect of the ecumen. I mean, essentially, it is a fairly benevolent form of colonization, but it's a kind of colonization that's happening here, isn't it? And what will be the repercussions of that on this people that have historically at least been now there are low scale local incursions, and there are certainly political betrayals, and there are personal feuds and things of that nature, but they haven't had war. So, but yeah, I like the title and the idea of the Taoism in there. I wonder what you thought of that, both of you actually, of how does Le Guin reconcile these people who are androgynous and therefore less inclined toward a dual way of looking. They even have that whole philosophy that I thought of Lecton a lot when I was reading about the what were they called, the monk type people who were
Oh, there's the Weaver. The head of
the
it is the
Weaver is
Weaver.
is is one of them. Yeah, and Genly makes
Tell them
friends
the
with
Weaver.
him. They make the
Yeah.
prophecy, the foretelling. They do the
Foretelling, yeah.
foretelling. But yeah, I'm curious to see what you think of that side of all of this, the more I guess philosophical side of this book. If either one of you want to talk about the Taoist parts of it, but also I think it'd be fun to get into those. I wish I could remember what they're called, but the ones who do the foretelling. And then
Mhm.
it seems like the Orgoreign people have a slightly different religion that has developed there out of, it's kind of like it's like they're the Protestants and the people in Carhide are the Catholics almost.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm
Yeah.
agree.
I
right?
have, yeah, I have so many thoughts about this. So trying to think of where to begin. Well, I think that one of the things that Genli is observing is how where he comes from, not only is there a binary norm when it comes to gender, but it rules, it's like insidious in all aspects of culture and society and government, and trying to see the way that this government functions, either in Carhide or even in the Orogray. I cannot say that word. I'm so sorry.
Orgoreign, maybe?
Orgorain. I should have practiced. So recognizing how societies can function, and like you both mentioned, neither of these societies are without flaws. There are certainly flaws and issues in both, but I think it's speaking to how we can integrate and look beyond these binaries. And I really love the yin yang symbol because I think there's this integrated aspect to it. And I feel as though Genli is one learning about that in society through Estevan. He's trying to learn to see Estevan beyond the role of male, female, and how do I see the person beyond that gender identity? But he's also learning from Estevan. He's learning through this interesting term that's not really translatable, Schiffgrather. So he's understanding the different ways of life and the different ways of understanding of these people. And when he comes upon that religion, the foretelling people, I can't remember the name of those people either, but there was somebody in there who was telling him that much of what they're interested is unlearning. There was a totally different mindset when it came to knowledge and when it came to this understanding of truth. And not only that, there's also a different understanding of the role of technology, because it seems like the people of this planet on Gethin are very deliberate about not allowing their technology to progress too quickly so that they are being outsourced by their own technology, so that they aren't
Mhm.
having their own resourceful qualities in their biology, but also in other aspects of life. Also, the beautiful quote that you were alluding to, Philip, about seeing about what patriotism means,
Mm.
the intersection between patriotism and bigotry, and how we can have love beyond borders. And at the same time, as we can have love beyond borders and see that those borders are maybe not real, at the same time as
Mhm.
to that, we could still acknowledge a right from a wrong. We could still acknowledge that when there's a leader of a country and they're going towards something that's maybe not moral, recognizing what's moral and what's not. I think that that was also alluded to in that as well. And then there's another bridge too, which is this idea, again, back to that connection between Genli and Estevan, talking about love as a bridge. And there's a wonderful quote, a friend. What is a friend in a world where any friend may be a lover at a new phase of the moon? But not only that, he also sees that it's through their shared differences rather than their likenesses that they find love, that they find that bridge. There's just so much to be said about divisions and non-divisions and integration and seeing beyond that. So I think the again the symbol of the yin yang is pervasive and powerful when it
And
comes to
yet, I think it's interesting how it's on the ice that
yeah.
they transcend all categories on the ice and they
Mhm.
come to an understanding of each other as human. And it's this in this blank white space in the ice where they have to of course survive together as well, and they form that bond that is just that's my favorite part of the whole thing is when
Yeah.
they're stripped of everything else. There's no society around them telling them what's what labels to put on each other. They just see each other as human, and they are stripped gradually of their assumptions about gender and society, where
And
you
even their
see
language,
Genli,
right? Even their
behaving in
language.
a
There's a
masculine
point
fashion. Sorry, like that.
I think even their language on the ice. There's a whole point where they only communicate mentally, or
Yes, yes,
for a time.
telepathically. Yes.
They stop using language, so they're even stripped of whatever falsity language gives them as well.
Yes, and they can only have truth between them when they communicate that
Yeah.
way. And
Mind
Genli
speak.
is stripped of his sort of masculine fears and assumptions, and he sees Estraven as a human, not as a
Mm.
not as a woman, but as a human, and only then
Yeah,
can they become true friends and refer
yeah.
to each other by their first names. Yeah,
I love that. And it
I,
also stretches it stretches Genli to even think back to his own planet and how strongly gender roles define people's lives. Like,
yeah.
and it's
mhm.
clear to me when I read that, like, oh, you've never thought about that before? You never thought about what it's like to be of a different sex anyway, and how that changes your whole life. So I love the way he stretched. And I love the way you said too about the ice, how that happens on the ice of all things. Go ahead. I'm so sorry, Lecton. I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt.
I, no, that's okay. I mean, I'm agreeing with everything you say, so it's okay. You can just keep saying it and I'm nodding in agreement. What I think is interesting about the yin yang situation and the nice little poem about the left hand of darkness is that generally when you think of the yin yang idea, it's about balance, right? And how there is this balance of light and dark. But here, it's less about balance and more about indivisibility. And so the yin yang symbol isn't necessarily always the best symbol because here it really is about you can't have one without the other and you can't take them apart because they're both inherent in the other. At least
Mhm.
that's what I felt, that it's less about balance. So that is part of it. There is a constant balance, but it's more about this idea that you can't have shadow without the light that casts shadow, right? And so that's how light is the left hand of it because you need to have both because they create each other. They don't repel each other; they create each other. And so the idea of having, as he calls he calls the man woman, and he's like, I have to keep remembering it's not a man, it's a man woman, which is an unfortunate play of language. But that there's this inseparability, which ends up being a balance at the end. You can't pull one thing out of it. And it's only when, as you said, on the ice, he comes to really understand them. And you get past these fabrications that you're able to see something different. And that goes to the quote you're mentioning about borders. And in the beginning, it's Esteban who says patriotism is fearing your enemy or fearing your neighbor. Like he's the one that says that at that dinner. But he's also the one that says, as they're journeying through the ice, when Gimli asks him, "Don't you hate Orgarin?" And he says this quote that kind of we've been playing with. Um, he says, "Hate Orgarin? No, how should I? How does one hate a country or love them? Tybe talks about it. I lack the trick of it. I know people. I know towns, farms, hills, and rivers and rocks. I know how the sun at sunset in autumn falls on the side of a certain plowland in the hills. But what is the sense in giving a boundary to all that? To giving a name and ceasing to love where that name ceased to apply? What is love of one's country? Is it the hate of one's uncountry? Then it's not a good. Is it simply self-love? That's a good thing, but one mustn't make a virtue of it or a profession. Insofar as I love life, I love the hills of the domain of Esther. But that sort of love does not have a boundary. It does not have a boundary line of hate. And beyond that, I'm ignorant, I hope. So this whole idea of there not being a firm distinction between one thing and another, in the same way that there is this indivisibility between light and darkness, I think is really embodied in the biology of these characters. And
Hmm.
yet their politics haven't necessarily reached that end. But that there is this indivisibility that is necessary just in the way they perceive the world, you know.
That's a good
Yeah.
point. And uh I like what you were saying too, that it's both and because like that you can't separate the two because the way that like when wrote these um Gethen Gethenians, is that the right word for it? The people of this
People on the
planet
planet. Yeah.
is that they do go through a phase in their cycle called Kemmer. So they do become either male or female. She didn't choose to make them androgynous throughout the whole story in a way. Like they do assume some role in that.
Mm-hmm.
They
And
all
even
have
Except
the
that
potential.
it's not the
They all have the
final,
potential to
yeah,
be
to
one or
be
the other.
to be both.
yeah.
Which sexual organs appear during Kemer just depends on who they're with and where they are at that time. It can go either way, which is why she said the king is pregnant, which is
Yeah.
one of her favorite lines. She mentions that in her essay. Just being
Yeah.
able to write the line "the king is pregnant" was very exciting for her, and I agree. But they both embody both. I agree that they can't be one or the other. And it's interesting. Anyone that stays in one gender role too long is considered a pervert, right? It's a perversion to only have one, which is, I think, a good comment on, like, basically this is a very 21st century term that I don't think Le Guin might have used, but toxic masculinity. and how you only can I you have one set of ideas of how you exist in the world, right? And here it's talking about their biology because of the unique situation. But to be so opposed to these other parts of yourself that might be considered soft, malleable, feminine, that you only grab onto this one part of yourself that is how you define yourself, which is so limiting that it is a perversion because you're denying important parts of yourself. And so I think that's something we can think of when we see this idea of toxic masculinity and this like willing or chosen decision to like shut out parts of ourselves that may be considered weak or quote unquote feminine, you know.
Mhm.
And I think that's something she's pointing, the idea that it's called a perversion, and how Genli is like still uncomfortable with that because he is a pervert in that definition, right, all the time. It's just an interesting, right? It's an interesting thing for him to struggle with.
Yeah. Something else I wanted to bring up with when it comes to Genli is towards the beginning of the book, I noticed that when he's proposing this alliance with the Ecumen and with the Gethenians, he does mention something along the lines of how he wants them to come together for shared knowledge and enrichment. And at the same time, in his mind, he said, I even question that. Like, I even question if that's really what the motivation is. So I found that interesting just to know. And it was also interesting how him revealing about his ship was what kind of changed the game with everything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Bit
Yeah,
of
well, I think this benevolent colonialism that Philip mentioned is right on point. That ultimately that's what they're doing. And to some extent, that's what the king is aware of. Like the king knows that once we touch something so much bigger than ourselves, I am not important. So of course I'm terrified. And the only reason that he's doing this in Karhide is because he landed. Like he doesn't have any, Genli doesn't have any real preference for Karhide versus Orgaren, right? It's kind of luck that that's where he ended up. And he even says like either one of you will kind of work because once the ship comes, you're both going to fall in line. Like it's not going to be one or the other. Once one of you gets on board, you're both going to have to get on board. So this fear of change, I think, is a real big part of it. And it has to do with this benevolent colonization, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And Genli himself comes from a world that was colonized in that fashion. And you get the feeling that he is perhaps, I mean, to volunteer for the role that he is, the envoy, you have to
Mm,
have some real belief in what you're doing. You have to have some zeal, and he may have the zeal of the newly converted here in this case, where
mm,
he's going forth on this mission, but he's also thoughtful at the same time and willing to learn. And I like that about him. As a character, I found
yeah,
him to be compelling because he believes in what he's doing, but he's also willing to question it at times and think about the repercussions even as he's doing it. And he bends the rules. He even, he teaches Estraven to do the telepathy, whatever it's called here.
Mind
Uh,
speak, yeah.
yeah, the mind speak. I think she's used that in other of her science fiction novels,
mm,
and other like in Rokannon's World or something like that. But
I haven't read
yeah,
Buchanan's World yet, but there is a technology that is the Ansible device. I'll just go ahead and say
yeah,
it. It's
okay.
in her other science fiction books as well.
It's in the Dispossessed and stuff. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah,
okay, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I find that I like how she presents him as the perfect adventurer. He's a bit of a Gulliver-like figure, if you
Mm.
were,
mm,
I mean, the whole part, this novel could be taught in an intercultural communication course, I think.
Ah, yes.
Very, very effectively. Because of even down to the things like they can't say L's, so they pronounce his name Genry, right? I mean,
Right.
stuff like that. I just these little touches in there. But the whole like learning he's learned their language, but he still hasn't learned their mindset. He's still learning their perspective, their worldview, as it were. And I love that. I love how this is such a great lesson in intercultural communication here on so many
mm,
levels.
Yes, I love that too. I want to quickly say that just speaking to that, I love this one passage where Genli later states that while he can't change the world, he can be changed by it. And he
mm,
also talks about Estevan's role as not necessarily trying to save Karhide, but mankind, that he had a bigger openness to what he was doing or broader picture to what he was doing. And then the Ecumen are just so interesting, even with what little we know about them. Being a mystic, I guess there was something about how they were referred to their role as mystics, in addition to being, I guess, scientific, and also this reverse doctrine to ends justify the means, that beginnings are as important.
And that
Yeah.
also connects to their idea of
Right.
this being year one, right? And
Oh,
there's
yeah.
we're in the now, and then there's the before and after, but we're centered in the now, right? They have a different conception of time, even, and how one counts the years. That's something that's from the very beginning. So
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah, that was
people of
really
winter are
interesting. The Gethanian
people of winter.
calendars all outlined there.
yeah,
The winter feel that progress is less important than present.
yes,
When he's complaining about not being able to go fast enough and how all the cars go really slowly, and he just wants to get out and run, he says that they're less concerned with progress than they are with present, which is what you're saying. Like, it's always year one, it's always now. It's really
yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
beautiful. I want to talk about one other theme that is associated with this novel, as Le Guin mentioned it in her essay. But I want to talk about the theme of betrayal because she said that that was an important theme in this story. And I don't think it's one that gets talked about as widely as the gender theme, which is for good reason, I think, because obviously this is such a revolutionary book when it comes to how gender is explored. But any thoughts about the theme of betrayal? Of course, we see I, Agriven's perceived betrayal when it comes to Estevan exiling him.
Yeah.
And we also obviously note that trust is something that Estevan and Genli are very slow to build with one another and understand with one another, and the role of advice that's given as well. And even up until the end with Estevan sacrificing himself
Hmm.
against what Genli wishes. So, I mean, there are various ways that we could look at the way betrayal is explored in this story, but I don't feel like it's very straightforward either.
Well, and of course, Estraven is labeled Estraven the betrayer, right?
That's right. Yes, that's true.
For his willingness to entertain the idea that, hey, maybe this ecumen has something to offer us, and maybe, so he's an interesting character because he's unafraid on some level where other people see an other and fear automatically. Estraven seems to have transcended that in some way. And he's, I think, more clear-sighted in that sense than a lot of the other characters. But does he betray, his Carhide in doing so? Or, there are betrayals. He is betrayed by his friend near the end as well. I forget his name, but the guy whose farm they go to, who
Oh,
he had
yes.
gotten him his living. Even Estraven had helped him in so many ways, but he betrays him. And of course, in Orgorain, poor Genli is horribly betrayed when the political faction that is ostensibly using him says, yeah, maybe he's too much trouble, little hot potato. They toss him to the secret police. Who obviously don't want see him as a very serious threat or as a potentially embarrassing fraud. So they send him off to the old farm there, the old work farm. And so there's so many betrayals, actually.
I
So
didn't even think about those. So, yes, I guess it is very overtly explored in the story. I totally
yeah,
didn't even
yeah,
think about that, but yes. Because I
yeah,
honestly wasn't really looking at the book in terms of that because I think I was so focused on the gender aspect of it. But now that you say it, yes, it's there are several betrayals throughout this book. Go ahead, Lecton.
I think also the idea of betrayal ties into this idea of truth that we are talking about. And that goes back to the idea of the Handarata and the foretellers and how their
those
goal is to
guys.
unlearn things, right? I think it works together. Betrayal, you need to have some sort of claim to something in order to betray it, right? This idea of betrayal has to have this claim where they explicitly say, like, my business is unlearning, not learning. Yet they foretell the future in these cryptic ways that don't actually always help people. Like one of the folklore that we hear, like the day you're going to die, they just say the day of the month, but it doesn't help him. It drives him crazy, right? Because he asked the wrong question. And so it leads me to wonder, like, what's the role of truth versus prophecy, and how does that work in this mindset, right? Is there a danger to that truth or to that prophecy, or trying to step outside of yourself in some way? And that, I think, at least for me, maybe this is a stretch, But this idea of betrayal, as she mentions in her essay, is important. And as you're talking about it, so explicitly mentioned later. But I think it ties into this idea of truth because truth has to do with knowing something. And truth has betrayal comes from when you're convinced that you know the way things should be, right? And so this idea of having some sort of claim to understanding or to realization, as opposed to going with the Geffen way of enjoying the now and not trying to grab onto it and force it to be what you expect it to be. I think they all work together. They're not one to one, but I think this, the way they grasp onto truth and meaning and prophecy, that whole section to me feels like it shows how prophecy isn't beneficial. Like holding on to the truth in that way, capital T truth, is can be harmful, right? If that's what you're seeking, but you don't seek it in the right way, it can be harmful. But that's what that story says. And even when he asks the question of them, his question, he keeps it simple. And his question is, will you be absorbed into the ecumen in the next 5 years? Or will you be absorbed into the ecumen? And they say yes in the next 5 years, or something like that. And he's like, well, it felt true. He's like, because it just seemed like the right thing, you know? I don't know. I just think the idea of truth is really interesting. And going back in a circle, the idea of unlearning and it being their role to unlearn. And he even says, like, well, I could teach you how to do this mind speak. And he says, no, I have no interest in being part of that type of change. And he says, well, the change is going to happen anyway. And he goes, then I'll change it when it happens. But I don't have to be the one that brings it along if that's not my role. So I think that all goes with betrayal. This idea of betraying who you are as a person, right? And betraying what you understand your role to be in this world. I don't know. I think she does a good job of taking these same themes, maybe like having, a couple different notes in this chord. And in the beginning, you hear like a few of the notes, and then you hear different ones in the middle and different ones in the end. But it's all the same thing being played, just in different ways throughout. So the idea of betrayal, the idea of homeland, the idea of prophecy, the idea of truth, the idea of progress, the idea of balance or indivisibility, these are things that she's just like looking at from different angles. And it's really an exciting thing to read, and that she can do it in such a way that, at least for me, I never felt the weirdness of the story. Like, obviously, trying to be in a society where you don't have a biological gender distinctions is so foreign to us, even for those of us that are progressive and are in support, like, wide displays of gender and ideas of gender. It'd be a very foreign world to live in. Yet that never is overwhelming to your engaging with the story. All that does is add more layers to pull you in deeper. So just the writing it has such a strong voice, and she knows what she's doing, that I just think that she's able to ask these really important questions when it doesn't feel heavy-handed, even though it can be. Like to have a world that's only these, hermaphrodites only develop sexual organs, once every couple of weeks. It feels like a very heavy-handed approach of talking about gender, but it doesn't come across that way. It could be, but it doesn't feel that way when reading. You know what I mean?
I do. I agree with you. And speaking of unlearning, I find the ending to be fascinating as well, where you have Genli reuniting with his fellow representatives from the Ecumen, and it's jarring for him. And Lectin, I know you can relate to this feeling. It's jarring for him because he sees them, and they're clearly female and male. And he has started to unlearn his societal assumptions by living in another place for 3 years. And it's actually a moment of like, it's almost like it's hard for him to rewrap his mind around. It makes you think about to what extent is our identity so fluid, and formed around our societal expectations and labels and so on and so forth. I've lived in other countries too, and I have found returning home to be very jarring in some respects because I've learned to see people and things a little differently after imbibing that other perspective for a while. And then coming back, and it's like, oh yeah, that's how it is here. I had forgotten that, and I had it had been an effort in the first place when I went abroad to learn their way of seeing things, but I thought of myself differently in that context. And then I come back here, and it's like, oh yeah, this is the perspective. I find it fascinating to see how fluid identity can be, in when experiencing this sort of thing, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think, so much of the difficulty of him as a character and of all of us is that we identify with who we understand ourselves to be so tightly that we don't recognize that inherent fluidity, that we're constantly changing, that nothing is set in stone,
Right.
that there is no permanent, this is me permanently, that it isn't going to change. but we tend to believe that because that's how we exist in the world, or we feel that's how we grasp onto the world. That this is me, I know who I am. And maybe I was a little different when I was a teenager, but now that I'm an adult, or now that I'm formed, like, I am who I am. And you don't realize, as you are constantly being transformed all the time, that nothing stays the same, right? This is just like a fundamental truth. And you see that in Taoism, and you see that also in Buddhism, obviously, which is my perspective. But you see it in these characters, as you're saying, that he's transformed by his time on Geffen. And he realizes it a little bit in those journal entries near the end, but it isn't until he is faced with his own culture again. He's like, no, wait, I was radically transformed, not
Yeah.
just a little bit, like quite radically. And it takes him that interaction going back to how things were to realize that the self that I was grasping onto and these ideas of masculine and feminine and how those define me that I was grasping onto, they're nothing but air. Like I was grasping onto bubbles that have no substance. And yet I gave them and was defined by these things that don't really, which is it's a way to end a story. That's the story.
And it's so circular when you go back to the beginning of the story and you read the tone and the way that the specific words he uses in those early passages. I feel like it adds a whole new weight when I reread that first page.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. This would be a very good reread for sure.
Oh my goodness.
Oh.
I know I need to reread this at some point because I feel like I'm a little out of my depths with this book. I feel like there was so much I appreciated, and it was an emotional journey, surprisingly emotional, especially I would say in the last third, the whole entire trek across the landscape, the volcano area, and then the glacier itself, the brutal conditions, the way that they're changed afterwards, the connections that they have, the misunderstandings they start to see through. All of that was such an emotional journey. And yet I feel like there are just layers upon layers that I could reread and get a deeper understanding of. I feel like I very much scratched the surface of this book.
I agree. I know we've been talking a while, so we're kind of wrapping up. But one of the things I think we didn't mention too much of is when you're looking at the gender aspect of it, and the fact that they only have these sexual desire 1 week out of every 6, like when they go into Kemer, that their life isn't like defined by desire in the same way. But then when that desire comes, they can't do anything but engage in it because they can't help it, right? They go into a lust frenzy 1 week every 6 weeks, and the way that affects how their dynamic society, I think, is really interesting. That what does it say about society when you aren't strapped down by desire and lust most of the time, but then when it comes, you can't avoid it. Like there's no choice but to give in to this overwhelming, almost biological need to satiate your lust or your desire or your biological presumption, as it may be. And I don't know what that says about gender necessarily, but it does say something about how we exist in relation to other society and what our desires and our over-sexualization of other people relates to as we create hierarchy and as we relate and create community and relationships to other people. That there's something about that desire that is destructive, I think.
Yeah. I think that you see them with far less shame and far more acceptance around their sexuality. And there's an understanding, okay, this person is an estrus, this is how they're going to behave, or Kemer or whatever, it's called. It's like estrus in our world. And it is, I think, just viewed as the way things are, and they don't overcomplicate it in the way that a lot of our societies do, with our weird, paradoxical denial and obsession simultaneous over sex, that we see also often in our world. I feel like they have a much more accepting view of it there.
Yeah. And the exploitation involved with sex as well. They don't really have that to the same degree that we have it here in our world. I think there was maybe one instance where it felt like it could have gone that direction when Estevan is in Orgo Reign, and there's a character there of their government who was trying to manipulate him by going into Kemer and meeting with him, trying to seduce him. There's one instance where it almost went that direction, but it didn't. But that's something that obviously is not the same as it is here. They have different sets of sexual taboos in that world than they do here as well. I know that's something that Le Guin talked a little bit in her essay as well.
Uh-huh. But there's
Mhm.
no mention of things like prostitution, for example. It wouldn't exist in that world, you know.
No, they have a Kemmer house, but a Kemmer house is like a public servant's house, basically.
Right,
Like if you
Yeah.
don't have a partner, you need somewhere to go to deal with this. So that's what the function that,
right.
right?
And anyone can go there. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's just interesting when that when you take that lust and that desire and those taboos of sexuality out of your everyday day to day life, then what does that let you do in their place? You know, and I guess you don't see too many things that are that revolutionary here, but it's an interesting thing to think about. When you take this, what is overwhelming for most humans, right, is our desire, and we use that as a way to engage with other people, right?
Mm.
When you strip that out, and at least for 5 weeks out of every six, it isn't there. It's not even that you're intentionally not acting on desire, but it isn't there. Then what can you replace it? What is it replaced by in your forming of societal bonds, right? And in your forming of relationships. And this comes to this idea of the intimacy that they share with each other that isn't going to be based on desire. So what is it based on? You know, because that desire only comes once every couple of weeks when they're in Esther or when they're in Cameron. And so you see even Estragon, his partner, who he had 3 children with, is now a celibate who's doing foretelling in one of these, you know, I don't remember what they're called, but like these little holdfasts up in the mountains,
Yeah.
right? So, but they still have this emotional relationship, right? Because his partner he tries to give his partner all this money when he is exiled, and his partner wants to get word and all these things. And so there's still an emotional relationship there, but it doesn't have the desire that we overlay on our relationship. So does
Right.
that make it more pure, or does that make it more feeble? Like how does desire function in human relationships? You know, and she doesn't go too much into it, but it is interesting. She gives us a little bit to think about, right?
Mm. Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite thought experiments of the book is, like you said, like how do we connect with people if that's not really there? And how
Mm-hmm.
much that defines our friendships or our connections with people, our intimacy or sense of love, like our love of somebody when sex isn't involved and there's no thought about that. And I really think it's beautiful and powerful the way that our character, that Genli is challenged by that. And the way that they also work through that and navigate that when Estevan does start to go through Kemmer, and that does
Mm-hmm.
get brought up, how they decide that they have that desire for each other, but that they're not going to pursue it because they need their friendship more. That was the impression I got.
Yeah. And one thing that's also absent is the idea of possessing another person.
Hmm.
And this is also reflected in the way they raise children and how the
Mm-hmm.
children are communal, essentially,
Hmm.
in these societies. So I found that to be a very compelling part of Le Guin's thinking through the entire, world building here. That you don't have the idea, and rape also isn't really. You have some kind of seduction that is manipulation that can happen, but you don't have the idea of owning another person sexually, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody's the same, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes. That's really interesting. It made me think a little bit of Sapolsky's Behave again, because
Uh-huh.
there was a passage in there. There's a passage in there, and now it's been a while since I've read that book, and I can't remember what hormone it was, if it was oxytocin, that makes people feel more bonded and close to each other, while at the same time othering others. Like you're part of my in group, and those people are not, and that maybe that's biologically, evolutionary wise, been part of human nature. But what if you take that away? Like, what if you reshift that whole entire construct? It's fascinating the way that's explored in this book on this world.
She even says in her essay that her first idea for the book was writing about a culture that never experienced war. And then the idea of the androgyny came second. And then in her essay, she says, is that cause and effect or is that effect and cause? I'm not quite sure. But
Mhm.
so we're looking at this idea of, she started with this idea of what does a culture look like that doesn't have war? And that led her to being, what is a culture that doesn't have the type of male-female relationship that we're so accustomed to? How do those work together? And how can that then, if you lose that object of manipulation, then what is the consequence of that? Or the absence of exploitation, she says. That's right. In her essay, the Gathenians do not rape their world, and they have developed technology, industry, etc. But they've done so slowly, absorbing the technology instead of letting it overwhelm them. So the way they relate to other humans is then shifted onto how they relate to their environment as well, right? So there is this parallel between their understanding of humanity and interhuman communication. Or I guess I don't know if they're human or with species who find
Yeah.
that, but interhuman communication versus like your ecological role and your relationship to the world, to the earth, and to the environment,
Yes.
how they work together. Right.
Something that really spoke to me in her other book, The Word for World is Forest, which also has a Terran coming to another planet, and there's colonization and all types of dominance and rape, and all types of things happen as far as that's concerned, in addition to the environmental theme. And I felt like when I was reading that book, I felt as though she was trying to make a connection between patriotism and dominance
Mm.
over of women and environmental exploitation of the planet. And here,
Mm,
actually, at one point, Genli talks about that, how they've stripped their forests bare, that their
mm-hmm.
world, the world where he's from, has been a disaster because of mankind stripping down forests. I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember exactly the word he used, but
Well, it's no accident that we've feminized nature, and we call it Mother Nature, and
Yeah.
ah,
No,
I think there's a point there that the idea of dominance and controlling someone else, that is a masculine impulse. That is and that's the point she makes through Orgoreign. This is a society where the people in charge know better, and they're going to tell you how to be, and you need to follow the rules. And if you step over those lines, then you get punished and you get re-educated, right? And I think that that's a very true thing in our world, that the more masculine, dominating way of seeing the world is and we often see that, by the way, in conflicts between cultures where we'll feminize the other in order to justify dominating them, in order to justify invading them. You see that over and over and over again in history. There's all kinds of books written about that. So for sure, and the idea that we deserve to do what we want with the world is very similar to the idea that a man should be able to do what he wants with his spouse, his wife, because she belongs to him, right? The world belongs to us. It's ours to do with what we want. I think there's a lot of parallels to be drawn there.
and I think something that's brought up in this book as well is this idea that Orgoreign, as the more progressive society, is considered the more sinister society. That was a statement that was brought up a couple of times in the book. So I
mm-hmm.
wonder about that as well, if that connects to that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they evolved further, and evolved gives the idea of progress here, I guess, but in a way, it's regress, right? It's not really
Yeah.
progress toward a more it under the veneer of being civilized and rational. It's actually quite brutal, really.
Yeah.
There's something about having an autocrat or a king where the situation is much more clear, right? You don't
Mm.
have the veneer. There is like a very clear set of lines, and this is how things work. And so when you have this veneer or this presentation of this more democratic society, but that really is only a veneer, as you say, and you have these secret police doing one thing and other political factors doing another thing, and you have these forced labor camps or re-education camps, then there is something much more sinister about that. And not knowing where you stand is sometimes more terrifying and more oppressive than being in an autocratic state, or can be, at least, and the when it's showing that like neither of these are the beneficial way to live, or to exist in society. Which, interestingly enough, though, so even though they don't have the gender dynamics and whatever comes with that we have, they still have these societies. So is it something inherent to existing as a higher life form that we're going to create this oppressive society? Like that's an interesting question as well. Because she doesn't hold them up as being like, look, since they don't have these gender dynamics and these politics, they are utopia, because they're not. Neither one of these societies are utopian societies. Granted, their environment is very, very difficult. The fact that they survive there at all is like a miracle. But there isn't a utopia. So then the question is, then what is the course towards utopia, or some sort of utopia? And is it this benevolent colonization, or is it something else? because neither of these have the answer. So I do think you look at the foretellers out in the mountains, they seem to have found some sort of utopia. Like the ones that are the closest to the earth, quote unquote, like the ones that are the closest to being as simple as possible and is not being involved in these political schemes and try to separate themselves from it. Those are the ones that seem to have the most peaceful lives and the lives that are most fulfilling, right?
Almost like a Buddhist monastery, right?
Well,
Yeah. And at the
Yeah.
same time, I feel like she is drawing some space. I don't know if I'm reading into this too much, but or making this up in my head, but with this interpretation, but I feel as though she is leaving some space to criticize as much as there might be a critical view of war at play. There's also possibly a critical view of pacifism as well. And I just say that with the idea of those work camps and the fact that they were giving them drugs in order to be more passive, in order to shut down, I guess I think it shuts down their cycle in a sense.
yeah.
But the idea was to make them more passive, to make them easier prisoners.
Right. But that's, of course, an act of aggression on the part of the authorities, right? They're essentially castrating and performing a lobotomy on these people in order to control them, which is it's all kind of 1984-ish, really, isn't it? You know,
Yeah, but I guess I agree with that. Well, I guess what I'm saying is to be in a state like that where you're being
Mm.
drugged and being
It's not a
completely
good thing.
passive is not the solution. Not to
Correct.
say it was proposed as a solution because it wasn't. It was to be obviously to control people and to do horrible things, horrible experiments. But yeah, it was some, and I'm sure it probably is something that was explored. She probably was taking some ideas from history as well with that.
Mm.
Mhm. But also it goes to them. It goes to the fact that what they were repressing is they were repressing their desire. They're repressing their sexual awakening that happened every. So there is something about that repression, about by forcibly, like you're saying, essentially chemically castrating them. But what it's doing is it's forcing them to not experience whatever type of desire or human desire that they normally have. And so what happens to you when that isn't allowed to you? So you have the celibates who are out in the mountains who are choosing to engage in this because it
That's the
lets
key.
them engage, right? It lets them engage in this higher level of reasoning and so forth. But they're making this active choice as opposed to having it stripped from you where you don't have a choice. And so what does that do to you? It destroys your spirit. And here it's obviously causing biological problems. But we can see as an analogy what it's doing is by having that choice stripped from you. That's the closest we see to like assault. Like there's no rape in this society, but this is pretty close to it. Like this is the closest analog. Is how do you have full control over another human being? Is you strip away their ability to make choices for themselves, but how they engage in their own experience of desire, lust, and sexuality. And once that's stripped from you, what are you left? You're left with a shell that just wanders around in the cold and does, manual labor.
And they weren't even imprisoned with like gates or locks. They could have left at any point, is what we learn later. But the drugs, like you said, they stripped them of their desire. So what change could they make?
Yeah.
That's a really scary idea for us to process. What happens if we're stripped from our desire to act?
Well, hopefully no
Well, I think,
politicians will read this.
Hopefully, what?
yeah, hopefully no politicians are saying, what does it happen to take away the choice from people, to not allow them to choose how to control their bodies, their lives?
Yeah.
Hopefully no one ever does that. That would be
Yeah.
bad.
Gosh.
Yikes.
This was written in 1969, which just blows my mind a little. You
Yeah.
know, like the gender politics. And I know she said she didn't intentionally think about it being about gender. Clearly, it is about gender, and she admitted that later, even if she wasn't thinking about it when she wrote it. But like, it's so like I read this and I don't feel like I'm reading a book that is what over 50 years old, right? Like it doesn't have that experience. Like all the issues she's talking about are perennial, and for better or worse, they're perennial ideas. But the writing itself is also really vibrant and it feels fresh. It doesn't feel dated in any way. So I constantly was like, this book is 1969. I had to keep reminding myself because the writing is so strong and the ideas are so coherent and relevant that I would forget it as I was reading.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand why it's considered one of the best science fiction books of all time, honestly.
Yeah.
Philip, I was wondering, I know you really love her Earthsea, a book, and I just bought the first four Earthsea novels, a collection of them. because it's been advised to me that I read them. And I had been worried going into them, thinking that they were more YA fantasy. It's because that's kind of how they're marketed a little bit. And I was told, no, they're not. Even though they're marketed that way, they're not. And I'm just curious, as someone who enjoys those so much and now has had his first taste of her sci-fi, what is your experience of her as a writer and as a thinker across the different genres? And just any thoughts you have?
Sure. Yeah. No, you can expect in any book of hers that I've read anyway, a lot of deep thought, a lot of philosophy, an economy of prose that is remarkable. That few writers are capable of saying as much in so little space as Le Guin. And she does it in her. I think her prose is actually more beautiful. Joanna asked me earlier. I think her prose is slightly more beautiful in the fantasy in the Earthsea books than it is. I think it's a little more functional here, but it's incredibly effective and economical. And yeah, I mean, she does, as I said earlier, one of the key facets of the Wizard of Earthsea is this yin yang business that we're talking about, and recognizing that life and death are actually two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And it's I think, the most beautiful book I've ever read in terms of reconciling oneself to death. Actually, it's
Really?
really, yeah, it's just great stuff. And the other ones become increasingly more feminist, and I say that as a compliment, as more consciously feminist as she continues with the series. And yeah, there's just a lot of really deep thematic exploration and a lot of beauty to those, and a fair amount of melancholy as well. But I think you'll enjoy them a lot.
Did you have a difficulty seeing that her authorial voice in this book after being so familiar with it from Earthsea, or can you tell that this is the same
I
perspective?
felt like, oh yeah, this is Le Guin. Yeah, there's a slight difference in emphasis, I would say, between
Yeah.
fantasy and science fiction. That when she's putting on her science fiction hat in this one, but it's still that same authorial voice, I think. Yeah.
I have to admit that I felt like the first chapter read a little bit like a fantasy novel to me
Uh-huh.
when we're in
Yeah.
that car hide procession and they're talking about the banners
Yeah.
and the
Oh, that's definitely.
instruments and the towers. I was thinking, is this fantasy? And then suddenly there are foray guns and
Yeah.
cars.
No, you're right. It definitely read like fantasy. It was very royal court fantasy almost in the very
Mhm.
beginning because you're putting full performance. And I think that is where I got my first taste of how she subtly is teaching us about Genli's experience of the world. Because he sees the king in front of him, and behind the king are like a bunch of soldiers who hold
Mhm.
guns. And he says, behind the king follows death. He doesn't say behind the king follows protectors or security. He says behind the king is death. And that is
Mhm.
your introduction to his mind is how he sees that, which it brings you right into the story. But I agree, it's more fantastical kind of setting. You know, I mean, I the more I've been reading this year, I've been reading a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, and I find the more and more I read, the blurrier it is sometimes to say like what
Yeah.
is one and the other.
Yeah.
It really is. And I know this is a little bit off topic, but reading the Library trilogy by Mark Lawrence,
Oh,
which is
brilliant.
marketed as fantasy, but it really feels like sci-fi.
It's as much
It must,
sci-fi as it is fantasy, for sure.
you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's like that line is so blurry. I think.
Yeah.
So it's exciting to hear that Le Guin plays in both sandboxes equally well, but she doesn't isolate them. Like she pulls a little bit of this into a little bit of that, which I
Yeah.
think goes with her ethos and her feminist anarchic outlook as well.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. I have a hard time deciding if I like I connected a little bit more strongly, I think, to the dispossessed. And part of that is because even though this has dual societies, the way that she describes the dual societies and the social themes in the dispossessed and the structure that she uses in the book to explore those themes really spoke to me. And at the same time, after processing, the more I process the left hand of darkness, the more it emotionally stirs in me.
Hmm.
So
Mm.
if I connect to her fantasy, which I am expecting I will, as much as I'm connecting to the other books I've read from her so far, I think she's could possibly going to be one of my favorite authors of all
Yeah.
time. Yeah, I'm a fan so far. I'm a fan so far.
Yeah,
So I
yeah, I
know.
read The Dispossessed so long ago that I'm really looking forward to a reread. And I think
Oh,
all of her work, just reading, as we said, it would benefit from a reread. And my
yeah.
memory of The Dispossessed is so hazy. that after reading this, I'm like, no, I definitely need to reread it. Like it's
Sounds
so,
like we better get together again later this year. Yeah.
Yay!
Yeah.
I'm here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both so much for this discussion. Again, I feel like I am speaking about this book a little out of my depths, as I feel like there's just so much to unpack in it. There are so many layers to it, but I couldn't have chosen better partners to unpack this book with. So I just thank you so much for your wonderful insights. You just brought so much to this discussion, both of you. Until next time, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.